In September 1939, at the very beginning of World War II, events began to unfold in the port of Murmansk that even then caused surprise among local residents and alarm among those who were privy to the international situation. At first, several German ships arrived with cargo and military equipment, explaining their visit as a necessity to seek shelter from possible attacks by enemy ships. But literally a week later, the situation took on a completely unusual character. There were already about 30 German ships at the berths in Murmansk. Among them was the American steamer City of Flint, captured by the Germans, whose appearance on Soviet territory gave rise to a lot of rumors and gossip. According to the official version announced at the time by the Soviet side, the German ships were hiding in Murmansk from pursuit by the Royal Navy, which was actively blocking the routes of the German merchant and military fleets in the Atlantic and Arctic. However, there is another much more intriguing version, which to this day has not been confirmed by documents, but is persistently passed on by word of mouth. According to this version, the presence of a significant number of German ships in the Soviet port was connected with a secret agreement between the USSR and the Third Reich. As part of this agreement, in addition to the well-known exchange of raw materials and technologies, it was planned to build a secret German naval base on Soviet territory, about 60 kilometers northwest of Murmansk, in an area of inaccessible and virtually uninhabited coastline. Negotiations on the creation of such a base were allegedly conducted in strict secrecy, with the direct participation of high-ranking representatives of both countries. According to the parties' plan, the base was to become a stronghold for the German fleet in the Arctic, providing mooring, repair, and supply facilities for military ships, as well as serving as a deployment site for submarines operating in the northern seas. Officially, none of the participants in the events mentioned these plans, and all documents, if they actually existed, were securely hidden in classified archives, access to which is still closed. Today, this story is shrouded in a thick fog of speculation and conspiracy theories. However, in the late 1930s, Nazi Germany did indeed have a serious strategic problem. The Reich's naval forces were in dire need of a developed system of ship bases in the northern seas. The Baltic Sea, surrounded by hostile or potentially hostile countries, was an extremely inconvenient theater of war, and the North Sea was under the close control of the British fleet. In addition, the Germans could not freely pass through the Northwestern Passage. Their ships and convoys were constantly at risk of being attacked by British aircraft and naval patrols. German warships damaged in fierce battles in the Atlantic were forced to return to their bases for repairs, and their route always passed through the Northwestern Sea Passage. This route, strategically important for the Third Reich, was also extremely dangerous. British warships, which completely dominated the seas at that time, awaited them there. The British, with their powerful fleet and well-organized intelligence system, became a real headache for the German naval command. Their actions could at any moment cut Germany off from all key maritime communications, depriving it of access to the Atlantic and jeopardizing the supply of raw materials and food, as well as the transfer of troops and equipment. Recognizing the strategic importance of controlling the northern seas, Great Britain developed a plan to create powerful minefields between the Orkney Islands and the coast of Norway. Such a move would effectively lock the entire German fleet in the North Sea, turning it into an isolated group unable to reach the ocean. In practice, this would mean London's complete control over the approaches to the North and Baltic Seas, which was absolutely unacceptable to Berlin. For the successful conduct of the war and operations on Germany's distant maritime borders, reliable access to the Atlantic Ocean was vital. But this required bases located outside the territory of the Reich, preferably in areas where British control was weak or non-existent. The problem was that Germany simply did not have such bases, and creating them from scratch on foreign territory in the context of the looming war seemed extremely difficult. It was at this moment that Berlin turned its attention to the Soviet Union, which had extensive northern coastlines that were poorly developed and difficult for the British fleet to access. On August 19, 1939, a German-Soviet trade agreement was signed, initiated by Berlin. Formally, it provided for the exchange of raw materials, technologies, and industrial equipment, but in reality, it was an important political step that contributed to strengthening relations between the two powers. A few days later, on August 23, 1939, Foreign Ministers Vyacheslav Molotov and Joachim von Ribbentrop signed a secret additional protocol to the Non-Aggression Pact, which went down in history as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Among other things, this document defined the spheres of influence of the USSR and Germany in Eastern Europe, which became the foundation for the future partition of Poland and the occupation of the Baltic states. And in September, the parties consolidated the agreements reached by signing the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Border. Berlin was convinced that, with the support of such a powerful continental partner as the Soviet Union, it would be able to break the naval blockade, break through to the Atlantic, and create new bases for its fleet that would allow it to conduct combat operations in the most distant maritime theaters. At that time, watching Europe rapidly slide into World War II, the Soviet Union was forced to maneuver between two hostile camps, choosing, as they say, the lesser of two evils. Cooperation with Nazi Germany, however ideologically unpleasant it may have seemed, was seen by the Kremlin as a way to buy time, strengthen its position, and avoid immediate involvement in the conflict. The treaties and agreements concluded in the summer and autumn of 1939 allowed Moscow not only to obtain modern technology, industrial equipment, and military models from Berlin, but also to ensure the relative security of its northern maritime borders. In October 1939, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, presented Hitler with a detailed report on the strategic necessity of establishing a secret German base on the Kola Peninsula. According to Raeder's plan, this base was to become a secluded, well-protected anchorage for the Reich's surface ships, where they could escape pursuit by the British fleet. In addition, the facility was to have a well-developed repair infrastructure, which would allow for the maintenance and repair of damaged ships without having to return to overloaded and vulnerable German ports. Special attention was to be paid to servicing submarines on combat duty in the North Atlantic. The proximity to the routes of Allied convoys heading for Great Britain and Canada enabled German submarines to operate more effectively, and a base on Soviet territory would have provided them with a regular supply of fuel, ammunition, and food. If the UK had gone ahead with its plan to completely block the German fleet's access to the Atlantic, this secret base would have been like a window to the ocean for the Third Reich, a link between the Norwegian, Barents, and Baltic Seas. Under the agreement signed between the USSR and Germany, the Soviet Union officially allowed German military and transport ships to enter the port of Murmansk. This decision had several advantages. It allowed Berlin to avoid clashes with British warships in the Northern Sea Route and also provided the opportunity to carry out a full range of repair work at Soviet shipyards. Moreover, Murmansk's unique climatic conditions, thanks to the warm Gulf Stream and the relatively calm waters of the Kola Bay, made it possible for ships to enter the Barents Sea even in the harshest winter frosts, when many other northern ports were covered with ice. During carefully classified negotiations at the end of 1939, the Soviet leadership made an offer to the Third Reich that was extremely tempting to the Germans from a military point of view: to locate their secret naval base in one of the most secluded and inaccessible places on the Kola Peninsula, in the western Litsa Bay, located about 60 kilometers northwest of Murmansk. This deep bay, protected from storms and ice, was ideal for mooring both large surface ships and submarines. The negotiations were conducted within the framework of the established exchange of resources and technologies between the USSR and Germany, which began after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In order to maintain complete secrecy, the future facility was given the code name Basis Nord, Base North. In return, the Soviet Union expected to receive valuable military technology and equipment from Germany, including ship armor, hydroacoustic equipment, modern mine and torpedo weapons, and a batch of military aircraft with a set of spare engines. The Germans showed keen interest in the project, and by November 1939, the port of Murmansk had become a transshipment base for the Third Reich, with about 30 German ships of various types stationed there. Among them, the luxurious transatlantic liner Bremen stood out in particular, which, according to researchers, was used as a floating base and residential complex for technical personnel involved in the preparation of Basis Nord. The appearance of such a large number of German ships in the Soviet port was officially explained by the need to shelter from possible attacks by the British fleet, but the true reasons were known only to a small circle of insiders. A secret order from the Kriegsmarine High Command stated the following: at the suggestion of the Soviet government, the German naval forces are to receive the bay of Zapadnaya Litsa. It is intended to be used as a base for military and merchant ships for the purposes of basing, supply, shelter from the enemy, and repair work. The name of the bay is not to be mentioned in official documents. Instead, use the designation Base North. The German submarine U-36 was sent to the western Litsa area for initial reconnaissance and to check the conditions of approach to the future facility. Its task was to assess the depths, mooring convenience, and safety of entering the bay, as well as to conduct covert surveillance of British activity in the area. However, the mission ended tragically. While still approaching its destination, U-36 was detected and sunk by the British submarine HMS Salmon. On their second attempt, several weeks after the tragic loss of U-36, the Germans finally managed to conduct a full reconnaissance of the future base. This time, submarine U-38, commanded by an experienced captain who managed to pass unnoticed through waters actively patrolled by the British, was sent to West Lizza Bay. At the end of December 1939, U-38 safely reached the designated area and carried out a detailed survey of the approaches to the bay, depths, currents, and convenient anchorages. Following this, at the very end of December, 3 German ships arrived from Murmansk and anchored in western Lizza. The picture that unfolded before the sailors fully met the expectations of the German command. The territory of the future Basis Nord remained completely undeveloped. There were no berths, port cranes, warehouses, or repair facilities in the bay. The ships had to anchor in unprepared anchorages and load and unload directly from the decks using their own winches and boats. Nevertheless, after inspection, the site was deemed ideal for the creation of a secret base. Western Lizza was located in a deep, narrow bay surrounded by high hills that reliably shielded the water area from observation both from the sea and from the air. So reliable, in fact, that, as German experts determined, even Soviet military units stationed in the region did not have the technical capability to maintain constant visual control over the entrance to the bay. It was located away from the main shipping routes of the Barents Sea and at a considerable distance from the exit of the Kola Bay, which made it practically invisible to casual observers. The only unnecessary factor in the presence of people in the area were the fishing collective farms located in the vicinity. This issue was resolved quickly and decisively. The local residents were resettled to Karelia. Interestingly, according to the German leadership's plan, the old collective farmhouses, workshops, and barns were to be used as natural camouflage for the covert placement of the base's service personnel, midshipmen, mechanics, radio operators, and supply personnel. Just a month after work began in western Lizza, intensive construction of berths, storage facilities, and areas for storing fuel and ammunition began. The work was carried out in difficult winter conditions. The temperature often dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, the winds raged, and the polar night almost completely deprived the builders of natural light. Nevertheless, with the help of powerful power units, compressors, and temporary power stations, it was possible to speed up the preparation of the site. At the same time, underground construction was underway. Protected bunkers and storage facilities were being cut out of the rock massifs, where it was planned to keep torpedoes, mine weapons, and spare parts for submarines. In December 1939, Captain Zur C. Nish was appointed senior naval commander of the base. He was an officer with experience of service in the north and was known for his ability to organize large infrastructure projects within tight deadlines. Several German meteorological vessels, Viking 5, Sachsenwald, and Kadingen, were officially assigned to Basis Nord to provide accurate weather forecasts for naval operations in the Barents Sea and the North Atlantic. By spring, the base had already begun to function as a supply hub. In April 1940, a German tanker left the western Lizza roadstead and headed for Narvik with a mission to supply fuel to the Kriegsmarine ships participating in the Norwegian campaign. Over time, the German naval leadership came to the conclusion that the base in the West Lizza Bay, despite its favorable location and relative secrecy, still had a number of significant drawbacks for the full-fledged basing of large Kriegsmarine ships. The depths and water area of the bay allowed only certain classes of ships to be accommodated, and the lack of developed coastal infrastructure, harsh climatic conditions, and logistical difficulties made the operation of the facility costly and technically complex. The situation also changed for strategic reasons. After the rapid capture of Norway in the spring of 1940, the Germans gained access to a whole network of convenient and ready-made ports, from Trondheim to Narvik. These harbors were much closer to the main theaters of war in the North Atlantic and offered much more favorable conditions for supplying and repairing the fleet. Thus, the initial acute need for Basis Nord declined sharply. In addition, the Soviet side, apparently already cautiously distancing itself from overly close cooperation with Germany, was increasingly insisting on moving the German base from western Lizza to the neighboring Gulf of Genk, which was more convenient for control. The formal justification was supposedly better hydrographic characteristics and closer proximity to Murmansk, but in fact this may have been related to the USSR's desire to keep the German presence under closer surveillance. By mid-1940, intelligence reports began to circulate among the highest echelons of the Soviet leadership that Germany was already developing plans to attack the Soviet Union. After receiving this information, Moscow decided to act decisively. All agreements concerning the location of the German base were cancelled. Work in Western Litsa was halted, and the base itself was mothballed. The Kriegsmarine ships left the area, the docks and warehouses were emptied, and the approaches to the bay were placed under the tacit control of the Soviet military. Information about the existence of Basis Nord was immediately classified and kept under the strictest secrecy. Any references in documents were replaced with code words, and on maps, the area was marked as a regular, closed zone. 3 decades passed, and in the early 1970s, construction began on a seal breeding facility in the western Litsa Bay, a unique center for training marine mammals for the needs of the Soviet Navy. When military builders began earthworks and underwater work, they stumbled upon unusual finds: rusty German machines, elements of old piers, metal tanks clearly intended for fuel storage, and even fragments of sea mines. All of this was carefully dismantled and removed, but the discovery caused genuine surprise among the workers. None of them knew at the time that 30 years earlier, a secret Kriegsmarine base had operated at this location. Today, Western Litsa still holds many secrets. According to some eyewitnesses, concrete foundations hidden under moss and bushes, the remains of stone shelters, and possibly underground passages leading deep into the hills can still be found in its vicinity. Most of these structures remain closed to the public, and the archives where detailed information about Basis Nord might be stored are still classified.